She walked into a room full of wolves wearing silk and called it a dinner table. They sharpened their knives behind napkins, smiled with teeth, and waited for her to bleed. What they didn't count on was him, Choi Tae-yoon, the most feared man in the Korean underworld, sitting at the head of that table, watching her with eyes that had never once softened for anything living. Until now. Until her. Something ancient and impossible cracked open inside his chest, and the wolves suddenly had a bigger problem than the woman they came to destroy. Welcome to AfroKorean romance, where love has no borders. If you believe in love, please like, share, and subscribe for more AfroKorean romance stories. The invitation had arrived on cream-colored paper sealed with black wax. The crest of the Choi family pressed into it like a warning. Amanda Osei turned it over in her hands twice before setting it on her kitchen counter and walking away from it. She walked back 30 seconds later. She was the newly appointed financial director of Choi Global Enterprises, 3 weeks into a position that half of Seoul hadn't expected a Nigerian Ghanaian woman from London to hold. The other half hadn't been paying attention until now. The dinner was mandatory. That was the word HR had used. Mandatory. As though a formal family dinner hosted by a crime lord disguised as a corporate emperor was simply another calendar item between quarterly reports and budget meetings. She wore black. Not because she was trying to make a statement, though she absolutely was, but because black was armor, and something in her bones told her she was walking into a war. The Choi estate sat 40 minutes outside Seoul, behind iron gates and ancient pine trees that had been watching secrets for 3 generations. Amanda's driver announced their arrival, and the gates opened without hesitation. That bothered her more than if they hadn't opened at all. Inside, the dining hall was the length of a cathedral, lit by chandeliers that cast everything in amber and shadow. 16 people were already seated when she entered. She felt every single pair of eyes land on her at once, some curious, some cold, some already calculating. She kept her chin level and her hands still. Choi Tae-yoon stood at the far end of the room. She had seen photographs. Photographs lied. In person, he was something photographs could not contain: tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been sewn directly onto his body, dark hair swept back from a face that was all clean angles and controlled expression. He was speaking quietly to a man beside him, and then he looked up, and looked directly at her. Amanda had been stared at her entire career. By men who doubted her, men who wanted to diminish her, men who confused her competence for luck. She knew how to absorb a stare and fire it back. But Choi Tae-yoon's gaze was not a challenge. It wasn't dismissal either. It was something far more unsettling, pure, focused attention, the kind a person gives to something they cannot look away from even when they know they should. She looked away first. She hated herself for it. A woman in a white dress glided to her side. Choi Soo-yeon, Tae-yoon's younger sister, her smile professionally warm. "Miss Osei, I'm so glad you came. Let me show you to your seat." Amanda followed her and noticed immediately that her seat was not in the middle of the table where guests of moderate importance were placed. Her seat was 3 down from the head. From him, the dinner began. The first 30 minutes were deceptively calm. Wine poured, pleasantries exchanged, the kind of polished small talk that rich people use as a blade. Amanda ate and listened more than she spoke, cataloging names and faces the way she always did in unfamiliar rooms, a habit born from years of being the only one who looked like her in spaces that weren't built for her. It was Choi Byung-chul who started it. Tae-yoon's uncle, seated directly across from Amanda, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He waited until the second course to lean forward slightly and say, in Korean he clearly assumed she wouldn't understand, "So this is the African woman they brought in to balance the books. Tell me, does she know what kind of family she's working for?" Laughter moved down that side of the table like a quiet wave. Amanda set her fork down. She looked at Byung-chul with an expression that was perfectly, terrifyingly pleasant and responded in flawless Korean. "I know exactly what family I'm working for, sir. I've read all the financial records, all of them." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds, then picked her fork back up and resumed eating. The laughter stopped. She didn't look at Tae-yoon. She felt him, though felt the shift in his stillness, the way a room shifts when something ignites inside it. Byung-chul's smile thinned. "Impressive language skills, though I wonder if a woman of your background truly understands the culture she's inserting herself into." "My background," Amanda said calmly, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. Includes a master's degree from LSE, 8 years restructuring criminal finance enterprises for legitimate conversion, and the ability to find exactly where money goes missing in a family business, and whose name it goes missing under. She tilted her head slightly. Should I be more specific? The silence that followed was the loudest thing Amanda had heard in years. It was broken by Choi Tae-yoon's voice, low and absolute, coming from the head of the table. That will be enough, uncle. Just 4 words. But the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Byung-chul sat back. The woman beside him stared at her plate. The rest of the table recalibrated quickly, conversations restarting like a machine rebooting after a shock. Amanda finally let herself glance at Tae-yoon. He was already looking at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't expected, not approval exactly, not admiration, something deeper and quieter than both. Something that looked frighteningly like recognition. After dinner, the guests moved to an adjoining room for drinks. Amanda stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the pines sway in the dark. She needed 30 seconds of quiet after the performance she had just delivered. Her hands, steady throughout dinner, were trembling slightly now. You knew about Byung-chul's accounts. She didn't startle. She'd heard him approach, sensed the particular weight of his presence the way you sense weather changing. She turned slowly. Tae-yoon stood closer than she'd expected, close enough that she had to recalibrate her breathing without letting him see her do it. Know about everyone's accounts, she said. That's my job. That's not what I mean. His voice was quiet. Everything about him was quiet. She was realizing the kind of quiet that contained enormous things. You didn't use that information to embarrass him. You used it to stop him. There's a difference. Amanda studied him. Up close, the controlled expression was still there, but there were fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he felt things he never showed. Are you thanking me or warning me? Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one, maybe. Which would you prefer? Honesty, she said. Always honesty. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those dark, steady eyes. Then I'm telling you that you handled yourself tonight better than most men who have sat at that table for years. And I'm also telling you, he paused, that my uncle doesn't forget. Neither do I, Amanda said. This time, he did almost smile. She thought about him on the drive home, which she resented. She thought about the way he'd silenced his uncle with 4 words. About the way he'd looked at her after, not like she was impressive, but like she was known. Like something about her was already familiar to him in a way that made no logical sense. She went home, changed, made tea, opened her laptop, and spent 2 hours working on the Choi subsidiary reports. Professional. Focused. Entirely in control. She thought about his voice 3 more times before she fell asleep. The next day there were flowers on her desk. Not a bouquet, a single stem in a slender glass vase. Black-eyed Susans, golden and bold, exactly the kind of flower someone would choose if they were paying very close attention to a person. No card. Her assistant, Jae-young, lingered in the doorway with a carefully neutral expression. They were here when I arrived, Miss Osei. Amanda stared at the flowers for a long moment. Then she sat down, opened her files, and did not allow herself to ask who had sent them. She knew. She spent the morning buried in the Choi Global subsidiary reports, numbers that told stories if you knew how to listen. What she was finding in those stories was making her deeply uncomfortable. Not because the finances were fraudulent on the surface. They weren't. They were brilliant, actually, layered with a sophistication that meant the architect had an extraordinary mind. But underneath, the legitimate structure were pressure points, places where the organization was vulnerable, and someone was pressing on those points deliberately from the inside. She flagged 3 accounts and forwarded her preliminary findings to Tae-yoon's private business email at noon. His response arrived 7 minutes later. Come to my office. Now, if you're available, she was available. She hated that she was immediately available. His office occupied the entire top floor of Choi Tower. The elevator required a private keycard she didn't have, but when she stepped into the lobby and mentioned his name to the reception desk, the head of security, a massive man named Director Kang, appeared within 90 seconds and escorted her up personally. She filed that information away. Tae-yoon was standing at the window when she entered. His jacket was off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, which was the most informal she'd seen him and still somehow felt like a significant event. He turned when he heard her come in. Close the door, he said. She did. Sit down. I prefer to stand. A pause. Of course you do. He moved to his desk and pulled up her report on the screen. Walk me through it. 40 minutes, they worked through the flagged accounts together, and Amanda discovered that Choi Tae-yoon in a professional setting was even more dangerous than Choi Tae-yoon at a dinner table. He was razor-sharp, absorbing information at a speed that forced her to match him, asking questions that cut directly to the marrow of each problem. He never interrupted. He never dismissed. He listened to her with his complete, undivided attention, and she found herself thinking, with the professional part of her brain that was still functioning, that she had never in her career felt so genuinely heard by someone with this level of power. It's Byung-chul, she said finally, laying out the last thread of evidence. Tae-yoon was quiet. He's been siphoning from the foundation accounts for at least 2 years, slowly enough that it wouldn't trigger standard audits. She turned from the screen and looked at him directly. He hosted last night's dinner. He tried to discredit me in front of the family, and his accounts are the ones I flagged. That is not coincidence. Tae-yoon sat back in his chair. His jaw was set, but his eyes, those dark, terrifyingly attentive eyes, moved to her face and stayed there. He found out I hired you before the official announcement. Someone in HR told him. Wanted me gone before I found this. Yes, the word hung between them. Amanda felt the weight of what it meant, not just financial fraud, but a deliberate attempt to neutralize her, to humiliate her at that dinner table and send her running before she found the thread that would unravel his scheme. And now? She asked. Now, Tae-yoon said quietly, he has a much larger problem than you. A few days later, the atmosphere inside Choi Global shifted. It was subtle, the kind of shift that only someone paying close attention would notice. Byung-chul no longer appeared at the executive floor. 2 of his allies were reassigned to regional offices on the same afternoon. No announcements. No drama. Simply a quiet, systematic rearrangement that spoke of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle an enemy without ever raising his voice. Amanda noticed. She always noticed. What she also noticed was that Tae-yoon had taken to walking through the financial department at irregular intervals. Not intrusively, he never stopped or spoke to her directly when others were around. He simply appeared, did a slow circuit of the floor, exchanged brief words with department heads, and left. But his eyes always found her once, briefly, before he went. Like checking that something precious was still where he left it, she told herself it was surveillance. Employer watching new employee, completely professional, entirely normal. She told herself this with less conviction each time. The trouble arrived on a Thursday in the form of Lee D1. He was the head of Choi Global's merger acquisitions team, young, Korean, classically handsome, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no. He appeared at the door of Amanda's office that Thursday afternoon with 2 coffees and a smile calibrated to charm. I heard the new financial director is the most interesting person on this floor, he said. I brought evidence to support my theory. He held up one of the coffees. Amanda looked at him for a moment, then at the coffee. What's in it? He laughed, genuinely surprised. Oat milk latte, Jae-young told me. He said it carefully on the edge of her desk. I'm D1 Mergers. I want to talk to you about the Harmon acquisition unofficially first because I think your perspective will be more useful than anyone else's. It was a good opener, professional but warm. She respected the approach. Sit down, she said. He did, and they talked for 45 minutes about the Harmon file, and he was good, she discovered. Sharp and creative, with an instinct for deal structure that complemented her own analytical approach. She liked him the way she liked a well-organized spreadsheet, efficiently and without complication. She did not notice Tae-yoon appear in the glass-walled corridor outside her office, but Jae-young did. And Jae-young's face performed a remarkable number of expressions in rapid succession before she found something neutral to arrange it into. Tae-yoon stood outside for exactly 40 seconds, long enough to take in D1 sitting across from Amanda, the 2 coffees, the easy laughter over something in the Harmon file. Then he walked on. His pace did not change. His expression did not change. But he called Director Kang from the elevator and said very quietly, "Pull Lee D1's full personnel file. Today." That evening, Amanda stayed late. The building emptied around her in layers, first the junior staff, then the managers, then the senior directors. By 8 o'clock, her floor was silent except for the hum of the climate system and the tap of her keyboard. She heard the elevator at 8:40. She knew the sound of his footsteps now, which was information she had not intended to acquire. Tae-yoon appeared in her doorway, jacket on, as if he'd been elsewhere and ended up here rather than the other way around. He looked at her screen, then at the empty coffee cup on her desk, the one from D1 which she'd drunk and hadn't thrown away because she kept forgetting. Something flickered in his face that he extinguished immediately. "Still here," he said. "I work here. It's almost 9. I'm aware of what time it is." She didn't look up from her screen. "Did you need something, Mr. Choi?" A pause. "Tae-yoon." Now she looked up. "Call me Tae-yoon," he said, and his voice had shifted into something quieter, less constructed. "You've been in this office 3 weeks and you've already done more to secure this company's future than people who have been here for years. I think we're past Mr. Choi." Amanda looked at him for a moment that stretched. "Tae-yoon," she said, and watched something happen in his expression that he hadn't entirely prepared for. "Go home," he said quietly. "I'll have Kang take you. I have a driver." 9 p.m. "He's been dismissed since 6. I checked." She stared at him. "You checked?" He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just held her gaze with that steady, consuming attention that was becoming the most destabilizing thing in her professional life. "Go home, Amanda." It was the first time he'd used her name, just her name. No title, no formality. Amanda. In his mouth, in his voice, it sounded like something he'd been holding for a while. She shut her laptop. Kang drove her home in a black vehicle with tinted windows, and Amanda spent the entire 20-minute journey staring out at Seoul's lit-up nightline and having a firm, serious conversation with herself about professional boundaries and the particular danger of confusing intensity for intimacy. She was mid-lecture when her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. The flowers were black-eyed Susans because you wore black to a room full of cowards and held your ground. "I thought they suited you." She read it twice. Then she saved the number under a contact name that took her 4 attempts to settle on. She finally typed. Tishi stared at that single letter for a long moment before locking her phone and forcing herself to look back out the window. The following week brought the shareholders' dinner, a different beast from the family event. This was public-facing, attended by investors, press-adjacent industry figures, and the kind of polished power that wore its danger in a suit. Amanda attended as a Choi global executive. She wore deep burgundy, a structured dress that fit her curves like it had been commissioned specifically for them, which it had, by a stylist she absolutely had not told anyone about. She was talking to 2 board members near the drinks table when she felt him before she saw him, that specific atmospheric shift, like pressure changing before a storm. She looked up and found Tae-yoon across the room, and he was already looking at her with an expression he hadn't bothered to pack away in time. She felt it in her sternum. Then D1 appeared at her elbow, glass in hand, saying something charming about the venue, and she turned to respond, and in her peripheral vision she saw Tae-yoon's jaw tighten imperceptibly and his gaze drop to his drink. By the time she looked back, his expression was sealed. But Soo-yeon, who had materialized quietly at Amanda's other side, leaned close and murmured with a small, secret smile, "My brother has not looked at anything else in this room since you walked in. I thought you should know." She glided away before Amanda could respond. The night ended without incident, but the tension it left behind was a living thing. Amanda drove home alone this time. She'd specifically arranged her own car because she needed the distance, and replayed Soo-yeon's words in the dark of the backseat until she made herself stop. She was not going to fall for her employer. She was not going to fall for a man who ran an empire with shadows woven through its foundation, no matter how quietly he spoke her name or how precisely he'd chosen those flowers. She had a career. She had a plan. She had spent years building a professional identity that no man, no matter how devastating in a charcoal suit, was going to dismantle. She went to bed with her jaw set and her resolve intact. She dreamed about him anyway. The danger came on a Tuesday, as danger usually does without invitation, wrapped in something ordinary. Amanda was in the parking structure beneath Choi Tower, walking to her car at 6:30 in the evening, when 2 men stepped out from between the vehicles. They were not Choi Global Security. She knew all the Choi security staff by now. These men were strangers, and strangers in the Choi parking structure meant they had gotten past multiple clearance points, which meant they had help from inside. She stopped walking immediately. "Miss Os," one of them said. His Korean was northern accented. "Mr. Choi Byung-chul would like a conversation." Mr. Choi Byung-chul, she said carefully, was removed from his position in this company. He has no standing to request anything. Wasn't asking. Amanda took one slow breath. She pressed the emergency alert on her phone, a button she had never used before, that she had programmed the first week she started this job because she was a woman who believed in preparation. She pressed it without removing the phone from her bag, without looking down, without giving any indication that she'd done anything at all. "Right," she said. "Tell me what he wants." She needed 3 minutes. She just needed to give Kang's team 3 minutes. She got 2.5. The sound of the elevator doors opening and the rapid movement of several large bodies through the parking structure was the most beautiful sound she'd heard in a long time. Kang's voice cut through the concrete space like a blade. The two men tried to run. They didn't get far. Amanda stood very still in the center of all of it, her hands steady, her breathing controlled, until the threat was neutralized. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to sit on the hood of her own car and put her face in her hands for 30 seconds. She was still sitting there when she heard the elevator again. One set of footsteps this time. She knew them. She pulled her hands from her face and straightened up before he reached her, because she was not going to let him see her shaking. But he was moving fast, faster than she'd ever seen him move, and when he stopped in front of her, the controlled expression was completely gone, and what was underneath it was something raw and furious and desperately relieved all at once. Amanda. Her name in his mouth, but different now. Stripped of everything except urgency. "Fine," she said. "You are not fine." He looked her over, not the way men look at women, but the way someone looks at a thing they thought they'd lost and found again. His jaw was working. His hands were in fists at his sides. "You pressed the alert." "It came to my phone." He said it quietly. "Before Kang's, it was rerouted to my personal number the day you started here." She stared at him. "You what?" "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd argue about it." A muscle moved in his jaw. "And I was right because I can see from your face that you're about to argue about it now. Tae-yoon, he sent men after you." His voice had dropped very low. "Because of what you found, because of me, because you walked into this family and did your job and he couldn't touch you any other way." He took one step closer, and the air between them compressed into something she could feel against her skin. "I should have moved faster against him. I should have— Stop." She stood up from the car hood. They were very close now, closer than they had been even in his office, closer than the dinner table. She had to tilt her chin up slightly to hold his gaze, and she did it with everything she had. "This is not your fault. He made a choice. I handled it. Kang's team handled it." She paused. "I'm fine." He looked at her for a long moment that said in no uncertain terms that he was not fine, that something in him had gone to a very dark place in the minutes between receiving her alert and reaching her, and it had left marks. "Come upstairs," he said. "Please." It was the please that undid her. His private office at this hour was different. Lower lighting, the city spread out through the floor-to-ceiling glass like a painting of itself, the quiet that comes when a building empties down to its bones. He poured her tea, proper tea, not the green tea that appeared at every meeting but the kind she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, in a conversation she hadn't thought he was memorizing. She noticed. She didn't comment. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let herself be still. Tae-yoon sat across from her rather than behind his desk. That was different, too. He was watching her with that attention she'd stopped trying to qualify. "Tell me you're going to press charges," she said. "I'm going to do considerably more than press charges. Through legal channels." He looked at her steadily. "Amanda, I mean it." She held his gaze. "Whatever else you are, I've been helping you build something legitimate here. Don't burn it down over this." Something shifted in his expression, something that looked unexpectedly like gratitude. Not for the advice, but for the fact that she said we. That she said this as if the work they'd been doing together was already shared. "Legal channels," he said quietly. "For now," she let out a breath. "But Kang will be with you," he added. "Every day, non-negotiable." "Tae-yoon, this," he said, "is not a discussion." She looked at him. He looked back. The silence had so much weight to it that she felt it settle on her shoulders like something warm. "Fine," she said. The following weeks reordered themselves around a new center of gravity. Byung Chul's fraud was turned over to prosecutors through the proper channels. As promised, though Amanda suspected there were parallel consequences being administered that she was deliberately not being told about and had decided not to ask about for everyone's sanity, Kang became her shadow. He was a large, quiet, competent man who blended into backgrounds with remarkable skill for someone his size. She stopped noticing him, which she understood was the point. What she could not stop noticing was Tae-yoon. He came to her office now. Not circling the floor, he came directly in, sitting across from her for sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes an hour, talking through the company's ongoing restructuring with the ease of a man who had slowly permitted himself to be somewhere he wanted to be. He brought things, not gifts exactly, but precise attentions. A book in English about Korean financial history that she'd mentioned wanting to find. A report from a London analyst she'd referenced. Lunch, once, from a Nigerian restaurant 40 minutes from the tower, which he presented without ceremony, and which she ate with her hands while he watched with an expression of quiet satisfaction that he absolutely did not realize was visible. She didn't tell him it was visible. She kept that like a secret. D1 asked her to dinner on a Wednesday, properly, not under the guise of work. He was charming about it, direct. She liked him enough to consider it for a full 30 seconds, and then said gently that she didn't think it was a good idea given the workplace dynamic. He accepted it with grace, which made her like him more. She learned the next morning, from Jae-young's expression, that Tae-yoon had seen D1 stop at her office the previous afternoon. She did not learn what Tae-yoon's expression had been during this observation, but Jae-young's mime of it, performed in the break room, thinking Amanda wasn't behind her, was very informative. That afternoon, Tae-yoon appeared in her doorway and asked, with studied casualness, whether the Harmon merger collaboration with the acquisitions team was still going smoothly. D1's team is doing excellent work, she said, watching his face. Good, he said, in a tone that meant several other things. He asked me to dinner, she added, a pause. His hand on the doorframe tightened just slightly. And I said no. She looked at her screen rather than at him because she was kind. I told him it was about the workplace dynamic. Silence. Then, that was the reason. She looked up then, met his eyes fully, and said nothing, because what she would have said wasn't something she was ready to hand him yet. He left without another word. But he stood outside the glass wall of her office for a moment longer than necessary before going, and she felt it on her skin like sunlight. The catalyst arrived without warning, the way the important ones always do. It was Soo-yeon who came to Amanda's apartment on a Sunday evening, and the look on her face made Amanda open the door wider without asking any questions. Someone has been talking to the press, Soo-yeon said, sitting on Amanda's sofa with her hands folded too tightly. About you and Tae-yoon. They're going to publish a story tomorrow, we think, that you were hired for personal reasons, that the financial reports were fabricated to remove Byung-chul because Tae-yoon is, she paused, that you are his, they're implying. I understand what they're implying, Amanda said quietly. Soo-yeon looked up. Her eyes were distressed in a way that seemed genuine. Tae-yoon doesn't know I'm here. He's been handling it through the legal team, trying to get an injunction. He would not want you to be frightened. I'm not frightened, Amanda said. It was 70% true. He wanted to come himself. I talked him out of it because I thought, Soo-yeon hesitated. I thought perhaps you needed to hear the truth from someone who isn't him. Amanda waited. He has never brought anyone to that family dinner, Soo-yeon said carefully. Not in 15 years of running this family, you were the first. He said it was professional protocol. She paused. It was not professional protocol, Miss Osei. Another pause. Amanda, it was not protocol. Room was very quiet. He doesn't know how to do this, Soo-yeon continued, and her voice had softened into something real and unpolished. He knows how to run an empire and protect people and make things happen. He does not know how to want someone and be afraid. This is new for him, and he will not show you that unless you give him a reason to believe you won't walk away from it. She looked at Amanda directly. Will you walk away from it? Amanda didn't sleep well. The story published at 6 the next morning splashed across 3 online outlets, salacious and insinuating, every implication carefully worded to avoid being provably false. Her phone rang 9 times before 7 a.m. She let it go to voicemail, got dressed in the sharpest suit she owned, and went to Choi Tower. She arrived before Tae-yoon. She was at her desk when he came off the elevator, and she saw through the glass wall the exact moment he saw her, the small, arrested pause in his step, something crossing his face that he shuddered so quickly she would have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. He came to her office, closed the door. You didn't have to come in today, he said. I'm not hiding in my apartment because someone published lies. He looked at her for a long moment. Amanda, I'm sorry. This is my fault, my world, my enemies using you as a pressure point. Stop apologizing for things that aren't your choice. She stood up from her desk, and suddenly the room felt smaller. I know who sent the story. It was someone in Byung-chul's network trying to discredit the financial findings before the prosecutor's hearing. I know that, you know that. The legal team knows that. She paused, holding his gaze. What I want to know is why you didn't come yourself last night. Question landed. She saw it land. Soo-yeon thought. I'm not asking what Soo-yeon thought. Her voice was steady. I'm asking what you thought. He was quiet. And in the quiet, Amanda watched something happen to his face that she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see: the architecture of control softening, layer by layer, until what was underneath was simply a man. Tired and careful, and holding something delicate that he was terrified of dropping. I thought, he said slowly, that you would look at what I am, what this family is, what this world is, and decide it wasn't worth it, that I wasn't worth it, and I thought it would be easier to believe that from a distance. Honesty of it hit her somewhere she wasn't braced for. You thought it would be easier, she repeated. Yes. Then what? He looked at her. The answer was in his eyes, enormous and certain and frightening in its completeness. Then watching you decide it up close, he said quietly. I wouldn't have survived that. Amanda closed the space between them in 3 steps and stood in front of him close enough that she had to look up and he had to look down, and the air between them was the most electrically charged thing she had ever been inside of. His hands came up slowly, carefully, as if asking permission at every inch, and settled on her face, tilting it up, and she let him, and then his forehead dropped to hers with a weight and a gentleness that knocked every composed, professional, reasonable thought completely out of her. Not going anywhere, she whispered. She felt him exhale, a long, slow release, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a very long time. When Kang knocked on the door 15 minutes later to report that the legal team needed Tae-yoon's signature on the injunction documents, neither of them acknowledged how long they'd been standing there. Tae-yoon stepped back. His expression was different now, not open exactly, but unlocked. He looked at Amanda and something moved in his face that was very close to a smile. He signed the injunction. The story was pulled from 2 of the 3 outlets by noon. The 3rd published a retraction by 3 p.m. Amanda's reports were submitted to the prosecutor's office with a full chain of evidence that afternoon, and Byung-chul's legal team had apparently already begun quiet negotiations about a settlement. The crisis, at its core, was over. The thing between them was just beginning. A few weeks later, when Seoul was beginning to soften into autumn and the ginkgo trees were turning yellow along the streets outside Choi Tower, Tae-yoon asked Amanda to dinner. Not a company event, not a family obligation. Just dinner. There's a restaurant, he said, not quite meeting her eyes for the first time since she'd known him. I've been to it twice. I thought about you both times. She went. The restaurant was small and quiet, and the food was extraordinary, and Tae-yoon outside of his professional context was something she hadn't fully accounted for: thoughtful and wryly funny and genuinely curious about her in the way that meant he'd been saving up questions. He asked about London, about her family in Ghana, about what had driven her into financial forensics. The detective work of numbers, she called it, and he smiled at that, a real smile, unhurried and warm, and she thought, there it is. That's the thing he keeps locked away. That smile. She told him things she hadn't told many people. He listened with the same absolute attention he brought to everything, but differently, personally, like he was building a map of her that he intended to keep. By the time they walked out into the autumn night, their hands had found each other's without either of them deciding it. On a Thursday evening 6 weeks after that first dinner, Amanda was working late again when she became aware that Tae-yoon had come and gone from her office doorway without entering. She found out the next morning from Jae-young, who had witnessed it, that he'd stood in the doorway for almost 2 minutes watching her work, and then left without disturbing her, and Jae-young's retelling of his expression during those 2 minutes was delivered in a reverent whisper usually reserved for religious experiences. That same morning, she arrived at her desk to find a key. A single key on a small silver ring. No note. She turned it over in her hands, frowning, and then looked up to find Tae-yoon standing in her doorway, in the actual doorway this time, watching her with his arms crossed and his expression doing that specific thing where it was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. Apartment 2 floors below mine, he said. It's been empty. It has better security than your current building. Kang has already approved the layout. A pause. You don't have to use it. Tae-yoon. I know. He unfolded his arms. I know, I just want you to be safe, that's all it is. She looked at the key, she looked at him. That's all it is, he held her gaze. No, he said quietly, but it's all I'm offering right now if that's what you need. She put the key in her pocket. She moved in 6 days later. The apartment was beautiful, all clean lines and warm light and a view of the city that made her stand at the window for 10 minutes the first night just breathing. She found, already in the kitchen, oat milk and the specific brand of tea she drank and fresh flowers on the counter. Black-eyed Susan's again. She stood in front of those flowers for a long time. Then she sent him a message. Stop showing up before I arrive. It's unsettling. Also, thank you. His reply came in under 30 seconds. I'll stop when it stops being necessary. Sleep well. She slept better than she had in months. 3 floors above her, Tae-yoon stood at his own window and looked out at the same city and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, to feel something without immediately dismantling it. The feeling was enormous and inconvenient and completely beyond management. He'd stopped trying to manage it weeks ago. He went to bed thinking about black-eyed Susans and a woman who spoke truth to a table full of wolves, and had not once, not for a single moment, made him feel like what he carried was too heavy. On a night in late November, during a storm that turned soul silver with rain, Tae-yoon knocked on her door at 10 in the evening. She opened it in bare feet and an oversized sweater, and he was standing in the hallway with his hair slightly damp from the walk between the elevator and her door. Something happened, he said. Come in. What had happened was this. The prosecutor's case had surfaced something Tae-yoon had not known, a connection between Byung-chul's network and a rival syndicate that had been targeting Choi Global's international operations for 2 years. The threat was larger than either of them had mapped. It would require dismantling carefully, and it would make waves, and in the short term it meant that his world, and everything adjacent to it, was going to become more dangerous before it became safer. He told her all of it. Sitting across from her in her living room with the rain against the windows, he told her everything, not just the operational facts but the weight of it, the exhaustion of carrying a family empire built on shadows and trying to turn it toward light, the cost of that in years and relationships, and the particular loneliness of being a man everyone feared and no one really knew. She listened. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She asked sharp, clarifying questions that told him she was understanding rather than recoiling, and somewhere in the middle of her asking about the syndicate's known connections in Europe, he stopped answering and just looked at her. She said, nothing. His voice was very quiet. Just you. Rain was loud against the glass. She looked at him steadily, and in the warmth of her living room with the storm outside and the full impossible truth of who he was laid out on the table between them, she reached across and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They talked until past midnight. When he left, because they were still learning the shape of what this was, and neither of them was in a hurry to rush it, he paused at the door and looked back at her. Amanda, he said, and there was a whole sentence in it that he wasn't ready to speak yet. I know, she said gently. Me too. By December, the Choi Global restructuring was complete. The financial reports were clean. The prosecutor's case against Byung-chul moved into its formal stage. Tae-yoon stood before his board of directors and presented a 5-year legitimacy roadmap that Amanda had helped him build, and when the board approved it unanimously, he looked up from the table and found her through the glass wall of the boardroom where she was at her own desk watching. He looked at her for one long, settled moment. Then he looked back at his board and continued. Later, she said, you didn't have to look at me. I know, he said. That's exactly why I did. On a Sunday in December when snow was coming down on Seoul for the first time that winter, Tae-yoon came to her door with her favorite tea and nothing else on his agenda, and they sat on her floor with the window open slightly and the cold air drifting in, talking about everything and nothing, and at some point she fell asleep against his shoulder and he sat perfectly still for an hour rather than disturb her, watching the snow fall on the city below. When she woke up, he was still there. She tilted her head back and looked at him upside down, and he looked back at her, and in the silence between them was every conversation they'd had, every flower, every key, every time he'd said her name like it was the only word in a language he was still learning. Tae-yoon, she said. Yes, ask me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he shifted to face her, and this time he didn't hide anything at all. His eyes were completely open, and what was in them was the kind of thing that rearranges a person's interior landscape permanently. Stay, he said. Not in the apartment below mine. With me. Because I have spent every day since the moment you walked into that dining room understanding that you are, he paused, searching for words with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom words are not typically insufficient. Everything I did not know I was waiting for, and I am not a man who waits. But I would have waited for you indefinitely, Amanda. I need you to know that. Snow was still falling. The city was quiet. Her heart was doing something she didn't have clinical terminology for. You would have waited, she said softly, indefinitely. She put both her hands against his face the way he had once held hers, gently, firmly, like something precious and exactly where it belonged, and said, "You don't have to wait anymore." What came after that was private, and warm, and belongs only to them. A fade into something that the snow outside witnessed and the city below suspected, and neither of them ever described to anyone, because some things are not for the world. Some things are just yours. Spring found them settled into each other the way that real things settle, not dramatically, but deeply, the way tree roots find water. Without announcement, without fanfare, with absolute certainty, Tae-yoon proposed in April. Not publicly, not in a restaurant, not with cameras, not as a performance. He proposed in Amanda's kitchen on a Tuesday evening while she was making egusi soup, and the apartment smelled like home. He came up behind her and placed a ring on the counter beside the spoon and said very simply, "Marry me, not because it makes sense, but because I cannot imagine a version of my life that you are not the center of." She turned around. He was holding the ring now, looking at her with eyes that were completely, vulnerably open. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He exhaled, that same long, released breath as the first time, as if he'd been holding it since October. He put the ring on her finger. She pulled him down to her by the front of his shirt and kissed him in the kitchen with the soup still on the stove. And outside the window, April rain was falling on Seoul, and it was nothing like a storm at all. It was just rain, ordinary and beautiful and exactly right. The wedding was small by Choi standards, which still meant 100 people in a traditional Korean ceremony that incorporated Ghanaian kente cloth woven into the decorations, and a blessing in 3 languages. Amanda walked in wearing white and gold, and Tae-yoon, standing at the front with his hands clasped, and his face wearing the expression that was usually hidden, but had been present more and more in recent months. That unhurried, warm, real smile watched her walk toward him with the composure of a man who had prepared very thoroughly for this moment, and was still somehow undone by it. Soo-yeon cried. Kang pretended not to. Jae-young did not pretend at all. Months later, on a quiet evening when the city was settling into summer, and the light came in gold through the windows of the apartment they shared. Not hers, not his. But theirs, fully and without distinction, Amanda sat across from Tae-yoon on the sofa with her feet tucked under her and said, without preamble, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the document he was reading and waited. She held up a small white test and said nothing. Tae-yoon set the document down very slowly. He looked at the test. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that started at his eyes and traveled all the way through him, visible even at a distance, enormous and quiet and complete. He crossed the room in 3 steps, gathered her into him with both arms and held on. "Hey, baby," she heard him say against her hair, so quietly that it was almost just breath. "Hey, baby," she confirmed. Outside, Seoul hummed and glittered and carried on being the city that had watched 2 people find each other across a dinner table full of wolves, and survive it, and build something that neither danger nor family nor scandal, nor the gap between 2 worlds had been able to dismantle. The kind of love that isn't convenient, or simple, or safe, but is, in every way that matters, absolutely certain. Choi Tae-yoon, who had never waited for anything in his life, had waited for her. Amanda Osei, who had walked into a room of wolves in black and held her ground, had let him. And now the world they were building together was starting, quietly, magnificently, to grow.